We are happy to be joining with you all for this afternoon's discussion with Manhattan Institute Director of Research and Senior Fellow, Judge Glock. The topic of today's discussion is Judge's recent article, The Regulatory Labyrinth, which explores one of the most progressive policy environments in the country and its implications on business growth and ultimately human flourishing. This article was written for the recently released special California-focused issue of City Journal, which is a publication of the Manhattan Institute. The entire issue is available on cityjournal.org and by mail for subscribers. I encourage you all to check it out. Before we get started, a few words about the format for today's call. In a moment, I will introduce Judge and then start off by posing to him some questions to help set the groundwork for the conversation. I will then turn things over to my co-host for today's call, J.R. Scott. J.R. is one of our Adam Smith Society chapter leaders at MIT Sloan, where he is pursuing a PhD in finance. J.R. will direct a few questions to Judge, after which point we will open up the floor to questions from all of you. Sean Pigeon from our team will be managing the question queue. If you would like to ask a question, please submit it to Sean via the chat function and we will get you in the queue. As a reminder, if you are able, please turn your camera on. It's nice to be able to see everyone. Finally, please note this call is being recorded. And with that, let's get started. Judge Glock is the Director of Research and a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor at City Journal. He was formerly the Senior Director of Policy and Research at the Cicero Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Austin, and a visiting professor of economics at West Virginia University. He writes about the intersection of economics, finance, and housing with a perspective informed by his work in economic history. Judge's work has been featured in a variety of publications, including National Affairs, the Journal of American History, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of the book, The Dead Pledge, The Origins of the Mortgage Market and Federal Bailouts, 1913 to 1939, recently published by Columbia University Press. He received his PhD in history with a focus on economic history from Rutgers University. Welcome, Judge. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Yale.
Let's start where you start in the article with housing. The availability of affordable housing is, of course, key to everything from labor supply to economic mobility and basic quality of life. High housing costs are also a concern, I imagine, that everyone on this call can personally relate to. And of course, California is notorious for its high housing costs. You mentioned in the article that in much of the country, the median house costs about 4 times the median income, whereas in parts of California, the median house can cost more than 12 times the median income. To ostensibly respond to this problem, California has implemented 2 policies that aim to provide more affordable housing, inclusionary zoning in many cities, and also statewide rent control. Can you start us off by explaining these policies and why they haven't, in fact, yielded their intended results?
Sure. So I'll start with inclusionary zoning, which some of you may be familiar with, but if you're not, it's one of the kind of wackier ideas to come out of contemporary progressivism or interventionist solutions to housing policy. So the idea is if you build more housing, you get taxed to pay for some of that housing being quote unquote affordable, usually what they call a percentage of area median income, say affordable to someone who makes 50% of what people in that city or that region make. So not surprisingly, when you tell people building more housing will earn you less returns and lead to less likely to have profits, you're going to get less housing. There's an abundance of research on this. And the idea that, as I often explain to you, even if you thought it was good to have somehow like rent controlled housing or to have certain housing that was stabilized at a certain level for lower income renters, the idea that the group you would want to tax to do that would be housing developers is completely backwards. You would want, if you're particularly concerned about housing prices, to put that burden on new developers to say they're the ones who are, in some ways, reducing the amount of affordable housing in the areas is just entirely backwards and strange. But many cities like Los Angeles say 20% of all new units have to be affordable for people under a certain income and so forth. And this is a huge deterrent to new housing production. The other one, rent control, I won't spend too much time on just because it's I think I used to tell my students that economists really only agree completely on two things. And one is trade is good, and two is rent control is bad. There's really no disagreement about that. And there was, I think it was Gunnar Myrdal, who was the famous Nobel-winning economist, said the two best ways to destroy a city are bombing and rent control. And because it's basically telling landlords, don't maintain your housing, don't build any new housing. The income for the existing housing won't be enough to sustain the maintenance on that housing often. And so you gradually see those housing units fall into decay. That's what happened, obviously, across much of New York in the 60s and 70s. And it's happened in many cities in California over the past, few decades, unfortunately, for this lower end rental housing. But it was in 2019 that California became only the second state to do statewide rent control. What's most depressing about this was championed by some of the pro-housing groups that we often the free market types would consider themselves allies of, the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement. I've talked to people in that group and they say, well, it was part of an exchange we had to do because they, people who wanted lower rents would vote for our production if we agreed to this statewide rent control provision. But that's exactly the sort of unfortunate log rolling that's gotten California in its present state and that's made housing prices so high.
Thanks, Judge. Can you also share with us how California's environmental laws affect housing supply?
Yeah, so it's also in a manner similar to inclusionary zoning, but more explicitly just wacky. And a lot of what the people who write about this like to point out is the most famous examples, this California Environmental Quality Act that requires these obscene environmental impact reports, thousands and thousands of pages if you're trying to build a new unit, if you're trying to clear a land, create a new road, whatever it is with development. And I start off the story with this kind of absurd example in Riverside County that before you build your local housing unit, you have to, as part of the quote unquote environmental impact, you have to show that there's no historic resources on there. But if you find some old clay pipes and bricks, well, then you got to hire an archaeologist who has to come and look at it. You have to hire a Native American monitor who's going to watch this archaeologist, make sure he doesn't push over any old bones or pots or whatever it is. They have to write 4 reports up to that. Then they have to give their construction workers mandatory cultural sensitivity training to make sure when they're digging, they don't accidentally mistreat one of the pots or the pipes or so forth. So the environmental laws, they go from that to restrictions on how much water you can use in your house. You have to recycle 65% of all of your construction waste if you're demolishing some old thing. So there's just an infinitude of these kind of absurd little restrictions that in the aggregate really add up to an incredible burden on new housing production, which is why you've seen housing production in California kind of lag the rest of the nation in terms of new housing permits per capita. While back in the 60s and 70s, it was the leader. So, the regulation switch in that is the clear and obvious culprit for that change.
If you were in charge of, deciding housing policy in California, are there any changes, in addition to getting rid of all the laws, regulations you just mentioned, are there any other changes you'd like to see made?
Well, yeah, obviously getting rid of the regulations and laws is the best and the easiest. And I used to tell my students too that, I wish there was some complicated, intricate explanation solution to the housing crisis, but it's really very simple. You create more supply. It's not it's not rocket science here. You allow people to build more, you get the regulations out of the way. But the other thing that I've written about a little bit elsewhere is they have this weird system where they redistribute property taxes in California. So if a local city builds more units in most of the country, that city gets to keep some of the property taxes, the upside of building, and everyone kind of gets the benefits of that. In California, thanks to these equalization rulings, that property tax increase gets redistributed to the rest of the state. And so locals say, why am I going to encourage building if I'm not going to see the upside of it? And so that leads, that not only is unfortunate in terms of individual units, it leads to a lot of these other regulations as means to keep out housing, when in the rest of the country you have an effort to make the locals buy into the argument for more housing. So just simple, get rid of the regulations and get those property taxes fixed, and you can go a long way to solving a lot of California's housing problems. But that's a big ask. I'm not pretending that's a little thing.
Let's turn to the topic of business. As you explained in the article, California was once a shining example of how to attract good manufacturing workers and businesses, but government overreach ended this. How so?
So regulation, once again, not surprisingly, is the reason here, the main reason. And I'll say that it's tough to measure the burden of regulation. It's something that faces researchers on the federal level all of the time. How do we know how impactful, and I hate that word, but I used it by accident, how impactful the regulations are in the economy? You know, we know how much government spends. You can do the taxes and you do it as percent of GDP, and there's the burden. But you know, we have very kind of clumsy measures of regulation. And the federal level, you do the size of the Code of Federal Regulations, 180,000 pages, keeps going up. You know, that means regulatory burden's probably going up too. In California, we have a bunch of different measures of that. And people at the Mercatus Center have counted the numbers of shalls, don'ts, must in the regulatory code and compared it to other states. And California leads the nation by a hefty margin. They have about 400,000 of these thou shalt and thou shalt not in their regulatory codes. The closest competitor, sorry for us in the Manhattan Institute, is New York, but that's only down at 300,000. So that regulatory burden has really obviously been the main impediment to California's success, and especially in manufacturing. So for a lot of us laptop tippity typing class type people, there's not much regulation can do to us. But if you're swinging a hammer, or you're trying to put a shovel in the ground, or trying to make a factory that might emit some little particulate matter or some smell into the air, then the regulations really hit you. And the environmental regulations are most burdensome there. So if you look at where those shalls and don'ts are, about 75,000 of those are in the building codes, and that's obviously the ones we talked about before. But the other biggest ones are things like oil manufacturing, chemical byproducts, et cetera. And that's made California, which used to be this manufacturing leader, about had the same amount of employees in manufacturing as the rest of the country, but they had this advanced manufacturing, semiconductor fabs and aerospace engineering. And now they're well below the national average, about 85%. And they've been declining much more rapidly as percent of the economy in manufacturing than other states. So they've really made an effort, most importantly because of those environmental restrictions, to drive manufacturing out of the state. And that's also impacted a lot of the other businesses and corporations as well.
I was struck in your article by your discussion of occupational licensing and the owners' regulations there in California, especially for the least privileged and least educated. Given how aggressive that is, can you speak to why there isn't more pushback on those?
Yeah, in California, it's a similar classic example of it's one of the most interest group controlled states. And, I'll give a simple reason for this is larger states and larger governmental units tend to be more beholden to interest groups. There's a lot of good research on this, that if you look at a little city, there's not a lot of free money, rents, as the economists say, to extract from that little city. And people are fairly attentive to what's happening in their little city, in their little town. The larger the units get, the less likely the median voter has control, and the more likely those interest groups are going to have a lot of say. And that goes for why Washington, D.C. tends to be more interest group heavy than the states, and why the big states tend to be more interest group heavy than the smaller ones, and all the way down to the municipalities. So that's a big reason why occupational licensing is so burdensome, despite the progressive embrace of changes to occupational licensing in a lot of the other states and so forth. So yeah, California, it's one of the few examples where California actually ranks not first but second on a worst of list in these regulatory burdens. As I mentioned, they're worse than regulatory burdens for Mercatus, for Cato, Pacific Research Institute, for Chief Executive Magazine. They're the worst place to do business, but they can really cheer that they're number 2 on worst occupational licensing regimes. Nevada, for some reason, beats them out. Who knew? So they have all the things you'd expect. Very high fees for people who want to get into everything from hairdressing to home entertainment installation requires its own license in California, unlike most states. Long training periods, high barriers, regular renewals, etc. So they have, as typical for California, they've allowed these local interest groups to capture a lot of the potential gains that could be had from more economic growth, and restrict especially the low income individuals who want to work there.
I wonder if you could also talk a bit about California's litigation culture and its impact on business, maybe by explaining the ubiquity of Prop 65 warnings.
Yeah, if I'll look up and nobody, does anyone raise their hand? You know what a Prop 65 warning is? Anyone who's been around in California? Yeah, I heard J.R. Scott mention earlier. For those who haven't, it's the weirdest thing. And I lived in California. I'm one of those Texas people that we ran. It's a great like triple pun. It's the tech people, Texas and Exodus, obviously. And I ran with the tech people out to Texas 2 years ago. But when I was in California, all over the place, you see these little stickers. This business contains chemicals known to the state of California to cause birth defects and et cetera, et cetera. And they're everywhere. They're bars, gas stations, et cetera. And this old proposition passed back in 1986 that says if you have one of these chemicals on your property, hey, if you're a gas station, turns out you have gasoline in the property, and if you drink a lot of that, it turns out to be a little carcinogenic. You want to limit consumption of that. So the California state, for your safety, reminds you, don't drink the gasoline. Here's a Prop 65 warning on your gas station. But one of the reasons it's so common is they enforce this regulation by litigation. They don't have a regulator that's actually checking everybody up to see if you have your Prop 65 warning up. If you have one of these chemicals, and famously recently coffee was declared was a carcinogen, and so coffee shops had to say, sorry, we have a chemical here that may give you cancer. It's coffee. You're in a coffee shop. And if you don't have those up, a lawyer can sue you. And just to be safe, so everyone just slaps these Prop 65 stickers all over their businesses and their products and what have you. And still, nonetheless, I mentioned, according to one study over the past 20 years, about $300 million in settlements happened due to Prop 65, and about 2/3 of that went to the lawyers who made the settlements. The harm victims, the poor people who didn't know that coffee might not be perfect for them, they only got 1/3 of that total. So that's typical of California's kind of regulatory regime, where they impose these burdensome regulations, and sometimes they have regulators pettifogging through all of your businesses and all of your actions, and sometimes they just have litigators complain about everything under the sun and sue you if you make a misstep.
It sounded like from your article, it's easier in California for people to have standing for lawsuits like this. Is that right?
That's right. And so California also has some special things, like the American with Disabilities Act gives someone standing to sue if they're disabled and they're not allowed access to some business. But to encourage more litigants, California gives extra monetary damages to these disabled individuals. And so you have these serial plaintiffs who do 100+ lawsuits against any business that has a step that's one level too high and so forth. And they get the quote unquote fix and then a few $1,000, and the businesses often have to pay the hundreds of thousands of fines and fees to make sure it's fixed. But yeah, they basically have very tenuous standing connection. You have somebody who might have been up into a business or wanted to go to a business at some point in the future. They dreamed about it, they thought about it in their home, and they weren't able to, and therefore they got standing to sue. So yeah, it makes it particularly difficult for businesses.
The plaintiffs' lawyers are doing very well in California.
Most definitely.
You mentioned a moment ago that you recently fled from California to Texas, along with many others. Elon Musk is well known. We recently had dinner, some of us at the Adam Smith Society, with Keith Raboy, who went to Miami. Others went to Texas. Are these outliers just well-known people we've heard of, or is this really a trend in the past couple of years?
Well, so there's definitely a trend, and it's not just anecdotal. Like Joshua Rao, a professor at Stanford, who also had a short piece in this California edition, showed that if you look at the exodus from California, how many high-income migrants are leaving the state, people that make over $1 million or $5 million, it was about 1.5% of those a year, pretty regularly. When they raised property taxes in 2014, it increased to 2%, and then post 2020, it increased to about 3.5%, 3 to 3.5%. So you have this mass exodus of these high income individuals that are fleeing the state. And it's particularly troublesome because in California, as many of you know, about 40% of the income taxes come from the top 1% of earners in the state. Joshua Rao estimates that actually they are now over the Laffer curve in California, in the sense the higher taxes that they actually have in place right now are actually reducing tax revenue because they're driving so many people out of the state right now. And you also seen that in the relocation of many corporate headquarters, not just Tesla, which did move to Texas, but also I believe it was Oracle, many others. About 11 Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 companies have fled the state in the past 3 years. So it's really happening. It's not anecdotal. California is losing high income population, but also general population for the first time in its history. And that's really dangerous for the future of the state.
So just to put a fine point on it, it's not just because of COVID that people are fleeing.
No. The studies in the past and the long-term trend has clearly been increases of high income individuals leaving the state, actually combined with mainly low income individuals leaving the state. The two groups that are leaving the state are the high income and the lower income working individuals who can no longer afford the state. And that's been going on for 7 or 8 years. It was increased by the tax increase in 2014, and it was increased again by the Trump tax cuts in 2017, which didn't allow high earners in California to deduct their high income taxes against their federal ones, which really increased the marginal burden on those people in the state. So it's real and it's substantial, and it's one of the reasons California is, for the first time in its history, or in the recent history, seen declines in housing prices. And as I maybe said before, there's actually 2 ways to reduce housing prices. One is to increase supply, and the other is to make your state so unlivable that the demand goes down. And California is doing a bang-up job of that second one, even if they're not doing a bang-up job of the first one.
For my final question before I call in JR, do you see a political pathway to reform? You mentioned there are lots of interest groups here, so presumably any answer is going to have to either overcome the interest groups or break up the interest groups somehow.
Yeah, there's always, when you look at the political science on this, people like Jones and Baumgarten who look at, like, how do you assemble a majoritarian coalition to overcome the interest groups? It's always difficult, but you need to show the average people that it's their particular interests are being sacrificed piecemeal to all of these kind of log rolling statutes and regulations and so forth. And obviously in the federal level, that happened in the past with the deregulation of trucking and airlines and banking in the 70s and 80s. And there's certainly possible that can happen again in California. The one thing I would say in California that's made it difficult is not only is the state large, which is a problem for that interest groups, but the state has something what you might call like a resource curse. If you know about development economics, that if you find this oil, the government can monopolize that and take that, and they don't have to tax their citizens, and so the government's not very responsive to them. In California, they've had the combined benefits of just literally having the unquestionably most beautiful country, part of the country in the world, or at least in America, and 2, having the Silicon Valley infrastructure network, which is kind of operated like a gold mine. Networks are very sticky, and you've had this gold mine that's been throwing off resources that the state could extract forever for all of these interest groups. And what's going to happen maybe is that with the gradual exodus of some of these individuals, that kind of gold mine is disappearing, and that may be precipitating some more demands for actual reform, because they can't just sit and hope for the best from the Silicon Valley billionaires who are going to pay for all of these other problems.
Great. Let's get JR on screen so he can follow up with some questions.
Oh, great. No, thank you, Dr. Glock. I really enjoyed your piece. It resonates with me quite a bit growing up. Like my father's a small business owner, and pointed to a number of the regulations that you mentioned in your article. And anecdotally, I have friends who are in real estate development, and they just don't build anymore in California, given the onerous environmental regulations. It was actually a perfect segue here. So to follow up on what you just said, so notwithstanding some of these recent high profile departures, you mentioned 11 of the Forbes 1000 companies, still 55 of the Fortune 500 companies are headquartered in California as of last year. So if these regulatory requirements, the burdens are so onerous, why do you think a lot of these companies, not just in tech in Silicon Valley, but banks, construction companies, have actually remained in California? And do you think it's just entirely the the benefit of having some sort of agglomeration economy, this network effect that you just mentioned, or is there something else going on here?
Yeah, thanks. It's largely the agglomeration effects. And one of the consistent and fundamental findings of urban economics is that cities and networks are sticky. I often use the example of what were the three biggest cities in the Northeast in 1800 in America. It was New York, Philadelphia, Boston. What are the three biggest cities in the Northeast in America in 2023? New York, Philadelphia, Boston, same exact order. Once a city has a certain number of people and certain industries, the industries do tend to be very, very sticky there. And all the infinitude of policy changes that have happened over the years obviously haven't either upset that order or the basic distribution of industries between those cities, although obviously there's been some shifts. So I am very confident that Silicon Valley is going to continue to exist in Silicon Valley as an epicenter. But now, what's the counterpoint to that? The one is that you could have the central defining headquarters in the area and lose most of the kind of tertiary and secondary benefits. You've seen this in Detroit. Obviously, auto manufacturing is 100% centered in Detroit, just like it was 100 years ago. But all of those other benefits, the small manufacturing, the smaller car companies, the smaller suppliers, et cetera, those have all filtered out. And you had Detroit, which was once the fourth largest metro in the country, drop like a stone to about the 14th. One of those few examples of where a big metro both boomed and busted completely. So you could see an example like that, where you still have Silicon Valley as the central agglomerated economy where the headquarters and some of the stuff happens, but all of those other things tied to tech get filtered out. And the last thing I'd say, this is California is losing its advantage in headquarters. So it used to be number one, and now it's number three. Texas, my home state, is number one again. They have the most Fortune 500 headquarters, and New York is still number two. Obviously, again, that's no part of like New York's wonderful pro-economic business policy, just the fact that those agglomeration economies are sticky in New York as they are elsewhere. So I don't deny that like California has a lot of those advantages, and those are going to stick no matter what happens. But a lot of the kind of trickle down benefits, we may say, of all of that economic growth in those high income industries clearly is leaving the state, and that seems going to continue over the next 10 to 20 years.
So to follow up on that, so one of the most, I would say, the lasting impacts of the pandemic has been this big rise in worker mobility that's been facilitated by the ability to telecommute. So if there is a situation, say the regulatory environment causes a situation where a lot of these large companies are going to move their headquarters out of state, but you have all these non-pecuniary benefits of living in California, the beautiful weather, the cultural institutions, the great universities. Do you see a potential environment being created in which you have a lot of workers who remain in the state, working in the state, whereas their companies are headquartered in other states? And would you think that that situation would be welfare enhancing? Would there be severe fiscal consequences in terms of corporate income tax revenue, which is non-negligible in California?
Yeah, I think that is a strong possibility. So the work for remote thing has got to be one of the greatest sort of urban economic shocks in human history, and something that happens so suddenly and so ubiquitously is kind of unprecedented, where you have something like 5% of the population or 5% of work hours being done remotely, jumping to what seems like a long-term trend of 25 to 30%, which is just absolutely wild. And we're still trying to figure out how that's gonna affect all of these areas. So so yes, there will always be a demand to living in California. And even more, kind of to get a little more granular, in any area that hasn't kind of hit the floor of how much it costs to build a new house versus the value of the house there in those areas, a new house is going to equal a house at all is going to equal a human in it. Pretty much there's a 1-to-1 or really a 1 to 2.3 correlation. And as long as that house is there, the price of housing is going to adjust, and the number of people living in California probably won't adjust that much. It's not like Detroit, where the price goes too low that the house burns down, and that's the best use of that land is for a big pile of rubble in the middle of northern Detroit. California, the price is going to keep going down until this all equilibrates. But in terms of those other headquarters and things leaving, they'll leave. Some of them will continue leaving. Some of them will continue staying, as I say. It won't be a huge fiscal impact. Corporate income tax in California, as in most states, is mainly decided by how much the corporation earns in that state. It's not really determined by their headquarters location. And headquarters now can be, they can be a few hundred people, even for a massive corporation. So even though people like me in Texas love to tout the Fortune 500 HQ numbers, that how much that really means for a state is maybe not the best possible metric one could use for it. But you're always going to see a demand for living in California. The positive amenity values are going to continue to be very high there. And what I think is mainly going to happen is, the fiscal consequences are going to go up mainly because of those high income earners leaving, not so much the corporations. And the housing prices are going to go down, which is also going to put a burden on the rest of the California budgets. But gradually you'll create a new equilibrium where a lot of those, again, excess gains that California was able to extract over the past 20 years are dissipated, and they have to actually act like a normal state again and do normal things.
Perfect. Okay, so I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but say compared to California, compared to say other states like Texas and Florida, I'm going to put my econometrics hat on and say we run a diffs and diffs regression. What do you think is the most important explanation behind this massive increase in regulatory burdens in California, say in comparison to similar states of a size like Florida or Texas? And I would say, like, the one thing that actually came to mind for me is California in recent years has become a majority minority state. Is it heightened political polarization due to these long-term demographic trends, immigration? Although you do see similar kind of trends in Texas and Florida as well in terms of immigration. So I don't know, like putting your econometrics hat on, if you're on a diffs and diffs, what do you think would be the one explanation for why regulation is becoming so much worse in California versus say Texas or Florida?
I think it's a good question. And my sort of answer earlier about the size of the state, I think is one reason. And you could even, and that's not, obviously by landmass, it's one of the largest states. I think, someone correct me, third behind Texas and Alaska, right? I think that's one of the big reasons, but it didn't become the largest population state until 1964. And I think it is somewhat interesting that you see immediate kind of increase in regulations and a decrease in growth when it became the largest state, starting around 1970. So that pure population mass importance might have had a big effect on that kind of growth and regulatory burden. The other things I talked about are those amenity effects, and I think the sort of downstream effects of both the Silicon Valley industrial cluster and the Hollywood industrial cluster in Southern California allowed for a lot more of those extraction interest groups to arise than they would in other states. But why is that? There's big industries, there's oil in Texas, there's big industries in Florida. Those are very large states as well. Why has this happened? It is just really hard to say. I can offer a bunch of other explanations, but some of them, one of my favorite underappreciated economic explanations is people just did bad policy. they did it because they believed it. They believed this was a good thing and they were wrong, but they tried it because that was where that's where their economic ideas took them. As Milton Friedman said, and as Robert Weaver, the famous conservative, said, ideas have consequences. They do seem to matter. California embraced a lot of these bad ideas a lot earlier than other states did. And maybe to add one more wrinkle on that is new policies create new politics. And there's certainly a snowball effect of when you create early sort of regulations in this sort. This creates political interest groups that have obvious interest in continuing them and capturing them. And so insofar as it was the first mover disadvantage in California imposing a lot of these burdens, they also created a new politics where these interest groups were particularly powerful. And that's perhaps led to a lot of the problems we've seen today.
I guess one thing that was in the article, which I don't think you addressed earlier, is it seems like in California, there are these unique ways of lobbying where firms can donate to the nonprofit organizations affiliated with a particular elected representative. I don't know if you could discuss that at all. I hadn't heard of that at all before. Is that something that goes on in other states, or is that really a California specific thing?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly how common it is across states. And so yeah, California does have this peculiar thing, which may just be a result of their disclosure and that their disclosure laws, and that they're requiring politicians to disclose when they ask somebody to donate to a particular charity. And maybe it happens in a lot of their states that we don't know it. But with California's kind of very strict in general campaign finance laws, I do find it very interesting. They have this new kind of way to extract money in donations from interest groups, which is I bequest, the term is bequest, you to donate to this nonprofit corporation. And hey, what a surprise, AT&T, Comcast, Silicon Valley Bank, which I mentioned in the article, which was overseen not by the federal government officially, but by the California state regulator, as was Silvergate Bank, I believe. They all donate to these bequests. And some of my favorite examples of that were Governor Gavin Newsom making numerous bequests on behalf of his wife's charity, where most of his wife's charity's income, or a large part of it, went directly into his wife's salary. So like this to me, if anything, for all the campaign donation requirements, like this seems much more explicit, like a bribe, than your usual I'm paying into your campaign finance fund. This is donate money to my wife's salary, which seems surprising to be legal, but that's the state of play in California right now. And it does seem to at least be somewhat more common in California than these other states who maybe have more traditional roots for campaign finance.
Okay, so last question for me, and one thing that really struck me when I was reading your article is the sheer amount of regulations in California that come from unelected bureaucracies or regulatory boards rather than through the regular legislative process. I guess I think I know what your answer to this question would be, but compare and contrast those two. So one argument I could say, like for me as a financial economist, probably the biggest burden of regulation for companies in terms of reducing their profits is that it increases economic uncertainty. That's going to higher their discount rates, so the NPV projects are going to be fewer positive NPV projects as a result. So do you think that the fact that many of the regulations are promulgated by these administrative agencies or regulatory boards increases regulatory uncertainty relative to it coming through this contentious log rolling judicial or legislative process, or that reduces economic uncertainty?
Yeah, thanks. And for those who non-cognizant, not in the know, it's a net present value, right? For the for the net present value projects, those don't go ahead because it's not worth it due to the uncertainty in California. So yes, I'm a big fan and reader of regulatory law and administrative law, and I just had a piece actually in Regulation Magazine. If you guys don't subscribe to it, I recommend it. It's one of my favorite quarterlies, right up there with City Journal, almost, on a piece of the origins of the regulatory state and why that was that upset the kind of traditional separation of powers in American history. So yeah, the reason America's founders and the state constitutional founders, when California did its present constitution in 1879, had a separation of powers. Like we don't think about it much since, fourth grade or whenever we learned this, but the whole reason that is the legislature is intentionally supposed to be slow, and it's supposed to allow a wide variety of voices to have a say inside the legislature. One of the biggest problems with transferring a lot of the legislative power to make general rules into these executive bodies is that, one, they can move much quicker, which does increase uncertainty. Slowness can be a real virtue when you're talking about policy development. You don't want policy to change rapidly depending on whoever happens to be in an office one day or the next. And two, it does allow, it's less likely to get that kind of majoritarian say into that regulator, because the regulator mainly listens to the small group of interest groups that appear before it, that work with it, etc. And so that's happened. I mentioned in the article that the California Office of Administrative Law accounts about 200 different agencies that can issue regulations in California. This is a massive number. I'm not sure entirely how it compares to other states, but it seems much larger. And one effect of that is these regulators, with no input from the legislature, can shift entire sectors of the economy. So it's the California Air Resources Board promised to ban gas cars by 2035. That wasn't even a law. I mean, that is a massive change to the entire American economy, which will be affected by that. And nobody even had to put their hand up in a legislature and vote for that. I think it was 5 people that just decided, and 3 of them have to agree. And they say, we're going to ban gas cars. And yes, that incredibly upsets settled expectations, investment expectations, the hope of what you can do in the future, what you plan to do. And that is a massive problem in California, and that's definitely growing as well.
Thanks, JR. Aaron Tao has a question. Miles, can you spotlight him, bring him on screen? And Aaron, please introduce yourself.
Hello, can you hear me? Yep, my name is Aaron Tao. I'm an Miss Society here, a member here in Austin, Texas. I worked in California from 2013 through 2015, like one of many of the exiles who left Texas left California for the greener pastures of freedom here in Texas. But I don't know if I'm one of the oddballs. My question for you is, do you have any studies on the people who have left California, and specifically when Californians flee to freer states such as Texas or Florida, do they carry their voting preferences with them and make that state bluer, as many Austin people here are concerned about, or have they learned their lesson?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's obviously a huge question, because as you're seeing this mass exodus of California, I think the number is around 8 million people have left California since 2010. Obviously, you've seen in-migration too, but the out-migration of the state is much larger than the in. So are they taking these California preferences, where California, in terms of voting, is the 3rd, I think, most liberal state in terms of presidential votes, I think right behind Hawaii and maybe Oregon. So it's right up there as some of the most liberal states in the country. And at least for Texas, thankfully, I do know that Chuck DeVore did some polls on this and found that people fleeing California tend to be lower middle class. Besides that very high-end group that I've talked about before, they tend to be lower middle class to middle class, middle-aged individuals with families. And that group actually tends to vote a little more conservative. And what Chuck DeVore found in his polls, is that they actually not only tend to be more conservative than California, but at least for Texas, tend to be slightly more conservative than your average Texan, which is maybe a little surprising. So they've tended to be actually more likely to push away the California model as opposed to embrace it. But I don't know how much that translates to the other states, and I've heard some people say different things in Nevada and in Arizona. At least for Texas, I think we're somewhat safe with being inundated with California policy carried on the rucksacks of people fleeing the state like refugees.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm going to call on Patrick Fay to ask a question. And if you, as a reminder to everyone, if you have a question to ask, please submit it to Sean via the chat. And Patrick, please introduce yourself.
Hey, thanks, AL. Yeah, Patrick Fay, former Smith Slack president, co-president with JR at MIT Sloan. I work at IBM in New York City. My question is around San Diego and sort of more broadly, because I know it was highlighted in the recent City Journal piece. Can you have these thriving municipalities sort of beneath these overregulated state burdens? And I know that's an example, but just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, San Diego, and I'm good friends with Jordan McGillis, who wrote that piece and who does live over there in San Diego. And it is somewhat of an exception. If you go there, it's much cleaner than other cities. They are allowing more building. The city has taken a lead in allowing more construction inside the limits. They have actually done a little more to control their homeless population there and the flown out. So I would say city powers inside of California are more limited than elsewhere. And one of the things that I mentioned before was you need more decentralization in California to allow these kind of different policies to take place on the local level. And also it allow the local cities to get more of the gains from growth and development than they presently do. But San Diego, most of what California cities can do is really around public safety. And that is not a small issue in California cities, but it is limited in terms of all the other things we care about. They can increase zoning or reduce zoning burdens on local house building, industrial builders, and so forth. But they don't have the same fiscal benefits of that as they would elsewhere. But they can't do anything about these California Environmental Quality Act regulations and obscene reports they have to write. They can't do anything about the making sure Native American monitors take binoculars to look at every time you turn over a shovel of dirt in the city. They can't do anything about the tax rate. They can't do anything about the local tax rate even, because these are largely set at the property taxes and sales taxes are largely set at the state level. They're pretty limited. And so the one thing they can do is that public safety. And I think, public safety can create a much more thriving environment that a lot of the present cities have over there. And as someone who used to live in San Francisco proper, I can attest that it's not an insignificant issue for people fleeing the state and the cities particularly. So I am not overly optimistic that San Diego can be a kind of kind of counterpoint to the entire state of California, but they can clearly do some things better. And I mean, maybe to get back to this point that I should emphasize, or maybe even overemphasize, is that the housing prices are what's gonna equilibrate in this the end. Like if California keeps doing poorly, those housing prices are going to keep declining until you create a more healthy ecosystem. And even regulations, in a sense, in the state of California. One of those main effects is just reducing the value of all the land in the state, because the value of starting a business in California is less. And if that can help equilibrate it and create a thriving environment where just the land is much cheaper, but a lot of these businesses offset that with the higher regulations, that may offer some hope for cities like San Diego.
Thanks, Patrick. We have one last question from the audience that was submitted via writing. Sean Pigeon is going to read the question. Oh, Sean, you're muted.
So sorry. Thanks. This is a question from the audience. He says, some high-profile former Californians said that they moved out during the COVID pandemic in response to some of the onerous restrictions. Has COVID accelerated the trends that you've been identifying throughout this call? Are you seeing that in the data? Just generally wanted to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, so it definitely is. I mentioned that the kind of high income exodus did happen and was occurring before COVID. But it has increased substantially since the 2020 onwards. I mentioned about 3 to 3.5% of these very high income individuals have left the state, a much higher rate than they were doing pre-COVID. But I mean, the total numbers are shocking. So 2020 was the first time in California's history that we know of, going back around 100 years when we had records, that they lost population in a single year. Total population. That includes foreign immigration, that includes natural births. The exodus from the state was so rapid that it overcame all those other inflows. And that continued in 2021, that continued in 2022. And again, you're seeing the housing price effects now. I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal just had a piece this morning that shows if you look at housing prices in the east part of America, they continue going up over the past year. And in the West, most importantly in California, they've been going down substantially by double-digit percentages in a single year. So the work from home phenomena is clearly accelerating the exodus from California. The COVID burdens were particularly onerous on there, and there's a big reason why people left. I'll just describe briefly my experience there. So when I was in San Francisco, they locked down the daycares, the libraries, the restaurants, the everything. Then they put chains up around the parking lots in other parks, so you couldn't go to another park. I don't know why going to a different park every day would spread COVID more than going to your same park. But they put chains around the parking lot so you couldn't drive into another park. And then they put police tape around the playground so you couldn't take your kids into the playground. And so I didn't have my kids in daycare. I didn't have my kids in school. And I couldn't go to a playground. So what did I do? I got a tiny little apartment that I'm bleeding money out the nose for in California. And I could take my kids out to a big grassy field with a ball and sit there for 4 hours. That's it. That was it. There was nothing else. I could have taken them on a slide. I couldn't take them into a library. I couldn't drop them off at a daycare. You sit there in the grassy field with a ball for 4 hours, and you do that day in, day out for months. It wasn't like a little thing. It was months and months of this. It was insanity. And so, yeah, getting to JR's point earlier about settled expectations and, the idea that I would invest a lot of my time and effort. And one could also say that one of the things I like to say, and we all know this to people who've moved, your network in a city, both friend network and professional network, is a substantial kind of capital building asset that you build over time. The longer you stay in a region, the more you're likely to build those network assets in the area. The fact that I was going to invest more and more time in staying in a state that could lock me in my house basically and tell my kids they could never go on a slide again was a little horrifying to me. So yes, COVID, I think, obviously accelerated by the statistics, and from my personal experience and others that flooded the time, I can tell you that it made us rightfully horrified at the idea of what California could do in a blink. And that also gets to J.R. Scott's point about administrators, that this wasn't some vote by the legislature, just a guy decided it. Somebody somewhere said, I'm going to shut down and put police tape around playgrounds. And nobody has a say, nobody can say anything, and he can change his mind. He could wake up tomorrow with a bad cough or with a stomach ache, and he can say, nah, I want to go back the other way, whatever it is. And yeah, that's rightfully frightening, and it definitely accelerated the exodus outside of the state, for me most especially.
Well, thank you, Judge. As scary as despairing as part of this conversation has been, we can also end on a high note by remembering we have a system of federalism, and there are different policy environments throughout the country, and that's like good. I'll plug for the system our founders.
Most definitely, it protects it. Anything that's actually inhibiting these interest groups, it is federalism. California has to actually listen in a way the U.S. government in D.C. doesn't entirely, because people like me can run out, and now they're feeling the consequences. But thank you for it.
Exactly. Well, please join me in thanking Judge Glock for joining us this afternoon. I'll do silent or loud applauses. Hope to see you all again soon.